Hey gang, and welcome back. Just a reminder, you can now use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, at flipsidegaming.com. You'll get 10% off orders over $10 and help with the channel at the same time. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for the second EDH game of the new year. My voice is a little bit on the fritz, but I'm not going to let that slow me down. This week, I am playing Titania, and I keep a hand with 2 snow-covered forests, Elvish Mystic, Life's Legacy, Splendid Reclamation, Gaia's Touch, and Nisa's Pilgrimage. Scott has been enjoying his Hazezon deck and keeps a hand with Avenger of Zendikar, Flamekin Zealot, Farseek, Kessig Wolfrun, Mountain, Forest, and Plateau. Fred is playing his Ezuri deck and keeps a hand with Hinterland Harbor, Spike Feeder, Cultivate, Umbral Mantle, Elvish Visionary, Island, and Devoted Druid. Lastly, Armin is playing his Anafenza deck and keeps a hand with Shaman of the Forgotten Ways, Thalia Heretic Cathar, Avacyn's Pilgrim, Scrubland, Sungrass Prairie, Forest, and a Plains. Scott wins the die roll and starts us off. Scott draws for the first turn of the game and plays a Plateau. I play a snow-covered forest, casting Elvish Mystic before passing to Fred. Fred plays a Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped and passes turn. Armin plays a forest and casts his own mana dork, Avacyn's Pilgrim, before passing to Scott. Scott drops a forest for his turn and casts a Farseek to go and find Taiga. I play a Blighted Woodland for my turn before paying 2 to cast Gaia's Touch. This allows me to play my second snow-covered forest, and using my 2 remaining lands, I cast Sylvan Library before passing turn. Fred plays an island, and passes. Armin plays a Scrubland for his turn, and is able to achieve a turn 2 Anafenza, which isn't too shabby. Scott plays a Stomping Ground tapped, choosing not to take 2 to have it come into play untapped, and casts a Spawning Pit before passing turn. I use my Sylvan Library trigger, and decide to take the full 8 and keep the extra cards. I then pay 3 to cast Nisa's Pilgrimage, finding 2 snow-covered forests and putting 1 onto the field and 1 into my hand, which I then play as my land for turn. With nothing else, I pass to Fred. Fred plays a Hinterland Harbor and copies my idea, playing Cultivate to put a forest onto the field and a forest into his hand. Armin plays a Polluted Delta for his turn, cracking it, taking 1 to go and find a Bayou. He then pays 3 to cast a Shaman of the Forgotten Ways and moves to combat. He swings Anafenza and the Pilgrim at me, and he gets his Anafenza trigger, putting a +1/+1 counter on the Pilgrim. As a result, I take 6, and with nothing else, Armin passes turn. Scott casts a Sterling Grove during his first main phase, and plays a Kessig Wolfrun for his land. With nothing else, he also passes. For this turn, I only take 4 from my Sylvan Library, keeping 1 extra card. I then sacrifice the Gaia's Touch and tap my mana dork to cast my own copy of Cultivate, grabbing another 2 snow-covered forests and putting 1 onto the field for the spell, and 1 as my land for turn. I then pay 6 to cast a Woodland Bellower, and go and find a Tireless Tracker from my library before passing to Fred. Fred plays a forest and brings out Ezuri, Claw of Progress before passing turn. Armin plays a Misty Rainforest, and tapping a forest and the Shaman brings out Thalia Heretic Cathar. Moving to combat, Armin swings Anafenza at Fred, getting in for 4 commander damage, and with nothing else, passes turn. Scott plays a Mountain for turn, and pays 4 to cast Parallel Lives, a card you never want to see on a token player's side. I use my library trigger, as you do, but don't keep any extra cards this turn. I then play a snow-covered forest in my main phase, and get a clue token from my Tireless Tracker, which Fred is nice enough to provide me with. I then cast an Elemental Bond, and pass to Fred. Fred drops a forest for his turn and casts an Elvish Visionary, drawing a card and gaining an experience counter. Fred remembers that it enters the battlefield tapped before he casts a Devoted Druid, gaining a second experience counter. Fred then passes through his phases and puts 2 +1/+1 counters on his Devoted Druid thanks to his combat step trigger from Ezuri. Armin cracks his Misty Rainforest and goes to find a Temple Garden before starting his turn. Armin plays a Windswept Heath, showing that his deck is 90% fetch lands and duels, and goes straight for the jugular, swinging Anafenza and Thalia at Fred. He puts the counter from Anafenza onto Thalia, and Fred takes 8. Armin then passes through his second main phase and goes to his end step, to which Scott responds to by using Path to Exile to take out Thalia. Armin uses this opportunity to save us some time, and he cracks his Heath to find a Savannah at the same time as he finds a basic. Scott casts a magic spell to help him draw land so he can cast Hazezon this turn, and I crack the Blighted Woodland to find 2 basics and gain 2 clue tokens as they come into play. Sadly, Scott's magic spell didn't help him too much, and he has to play a Goblin Bombardment. Fred, having seen last week's game, also decides to cast a Summon Sandwich spell. Stunned by Fred's awesome play, Scott passes turn. Once again, I don't keep any extras from library this turn, and instead I cast Titania in my first main phase. I draw from the Elemental Bond, and bring back the Blighted Woodland, gaining a clue token, all for only 5 mana. I then completely undo all of this good mojo by playing a snow-covered forest and forgetting to gain a clue token, before moving to my combat step, where I decide to swing the Woodland Bellower at Armin for 6. For Fred's turn, he casts the Peregrine Drake during his first main phase to gain an experience counter for essentially 0 mana. Fred then casts Priest of Titania, which will potentially tap for 5, and gains another counter. Moving to combat, Fred puts the counters on his new Drake, and passes through to his end step. Armin plays a Plains and moves straight to combat, swinging the Anafenza and Pilgrim at Scott. The Pilgrim gets another +1/+1 counter from Anafenza, and Scott takes 7 while I sacrifice my Blighted Whiteland again to get 2 more basics, gain a 5/3 elemental, and get 2 clue tokens. Unfortunately for me, Armin flashes in a Hushwing Griff in response to my Titania trigger, and when the elemental comes in, I don't get to draw a card. With Armin getting the damage in, he has nothing else to do, and passes turn. Scott draws for turn, and without a 7th land, not to mention with a Griff on the field, Scott's plan of casting his commander doesn't come to fruition, and he passes turn. At the end of Scott's turn, I sacrifice one of my clue tokens to draw a card, and put a +1/+1 counter on Tireless Tracker. For my turn, I cast Claw of Gix in my main phase, a staple in most Titania decks. Moving to combat, I swing the Bellower and Elemental token at Armin, and the Tireless Tracker at Scott. With the damage being dealt, I then pass my turn, and Fred cracks his Myriad Landscape while I apparently rearrange my lands into piles of 3 to go and find 2 basics. Fred plays a Forest for his turn, and gets straight to the point by dropping his Umbral Mantle. Fred then moves to equip once the spell is resolved, and I cast Beast Within to blow up the equipment. Fred then casts a Spike Feeder, who sadly doesn't give him an experience counter thanks to the Hushwing Griff. Moving to combat, Fred puts the counters on his Drake once again and swings at me for 10 points of damage. I fog the damage though, casting Constant Mist and sacrificing a land to pay for his buyback cost. I get an elemental token, and Fred passes turn. Armin plays a Plains before casting a Deathrite Shaman. He then moves to combat, swinging Anafenza and the Hushwing at Scott. With Anafenza's trigger still on the stack, Scott exiles the Hushwing Griff with his Swords to Plowshares. He does take 4 commander damage though, and with nothing else, Armin passes turn. Scott draws for his turn, but is still stuck on 6 lands. He wishes there were such a thing as enchantment lands, as he could go and find it with Sterling Grove, but since we don't live in Magical Christmas Land, Scott has to face reality and instead passes turn. At the end of Scott's turn, I sacrifice 2 of my lands with my Claw, gaining 2 life and 2 elemental tokens, who draw me cards as they enter the battlefield. I play a Snow-Covered Forest in my main phase and gain a clue token. I then target Ezuri Claw of Progress with my Song of the Dryad, before swinging all of my tokens and Bellower at Fred. Moving to blockers, Fred chumps a Bellower with his Elvish Visionary, trades his Beast token with one of my tokens, and blocks another 2 tokens with Devoted Druid and Spike Feeder. Before damage is done though, Fred removes the counters from his Spike Feeder to gain 4 life. With Fred's effective use of blockers, unfortunately I only get in for 1 point of damage. In my second main phase, I cast Life's Legacy, sacrificing the Bellower to draw 6 cards. I then cast a Finhorn Elves before discarding a land and regrowth. At the start of Fred's turn, I realized that my Bellower should have been exiled, but thankfully Fred has been keeping track of his own creatures. I correct this matter, and Fred plays a Forest and has to pass to Armin. Armin plays a Sungrass Prairie's Head in his hand since the get-go, and once again swings at Scott. He gives his Pilgrim another +1/+1 counter, and Scott has no choice but to take the hit. Scott finally finds his 7th land for the game, and drops a Plains. He casts his Hazezon Tamar, and passes to me. At the end of Scott's turn, I sacrifice 4 lands, gaining 4 life and 4 elementals, who will each draw me a card as they enter the battlefield. I play a Jund Panorama in my first main phase as my land for turn, and then pay 4 to cast Splendid Reclamation. With the spell in the stack, I tap 2 lands to sacrifice themselves, gaining 2 more life and 2 more elemental tokens. These draw me 2 cards, and once everything's resolved, I follow up with a Concordant Crossroads to help swing my newly made elementals, and move to combat. Unfortunately, my threat assessment at this point is a little bit questionable, and I swing 5 of my elementals at Fred, and the 4 remaining at Armin with the Tireless Tracker. Fred blocks one of my elementals with his Drake, taking 20, and Armin chumps with his Deathrite, activating its ability by paying 1 black to exile an instant or sorcery, and deals 2 damage to all of his opponents before it dies. Armin does get his just desserts though, and he takes the remaining damage before I move through my main phase and end step. Fred draws for turn and plays a Forest. He then asks the table for some help dealing with me, and Armin kindly removes my Song of the Dryads with a Croson Grip from his Ezuri. Fred then casts a Jiraga Tree Speaker, gaining his 5th experience counter, before casting a Mausoleum Wanderer, gaining another experience counter. Moving to combat, Fred puts the counters from his Ezuri trigger on his new Spirit, and swings the Drake at me for 10. With nothing else, he passes to Armin. Armin moves to combat, as he's done since turn 3 essentially, and swings the Pilgrim and Anafenza at Scott. The Pilgrim gains another counter, and Scott happily puts his Hazezon in front of Anafenza, only taking 5 damage. Scott untaps for his turn, and with the Hazezon trigger on the stack, he sacrifices his Sterling Grove to go and find Shared Animosity, putting on top of his library. He then gets 14 warrior tokens from the trigger before drawing for turn. It's pretty safe to say what happens next, and Scott casts Shared Animosity in his first main phase. Scott then moves to combat, swinging everything at me. I try and cast Constant Miss with a buyback, sacrificing a land and getting an elemental token, but Fred counters the spell by sacrificing his spirit. After killing me in his combat step, Scott finishes off Fred and Armin by sacrificing his Valiant Soldier tokens to Goblin Bombardment, and we move on to the next game. Game review time, so I'm not too sure what I can say other than the fact that my voice is failing me and there was a lot of poor threat assessment. I think there were several misplays in this game, and the two most notable are my casting Concordant Crossroads and Armin using Krosan Grip. Both of us essentially enabled Scott to win on his next turn by casting these spells, and there was very little reason for either of us to do it. My casting Concordant Crossroads was the definition of greed, and getting in for extra damage and not having directed it at Scott was a big no-no. Keeping them back as blockers still wouldn't have saved me, but it wouldn't have allowed Scott to be able to swing as easily with his creatures as they wouldn't have had haste. Armin using the Krosan Grip on Song of the Dryads to save Ezuri was a bit loose. I can understand wanting to buy some good karma with Fred as his creatures are getting bigger and bigger after every combat step, but considering how explosive Hazezon can be and how immediate he can be a threat, there really wasn't a lot of benefit for trying to build up karma for a longer game. I do think Fred sacrificing the Mausoleum Wanderer on the Constant Miss was probably the right idea, since fogging the combat was essentially going to give me the game. Sure, it may have come across as a bit of a spite play, but the fact that Armin and Fred were so low in life and would die to Goblin Bombardment anyway basically allowed Fred to choose who he wanted to win. And I can't fault him for being jealous of my sweet Titania deck. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/MTGMudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/MTGMudsta. This video is brought to you in part by support from my Patreons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit my Patreon link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.